There are moments in history when a single day is enough to change the course of the world forever. And September 11, 2001 was one such day. When the twin towers of the World Trade Center collapsed, not only were thousands of innocent lives buried under the rubble, but the symbol of global peace and security was shaken to its core. Behind the dense black smoke, one name echoed everywhere: Osama bin Laden. The self-proclaimed holy warrior was not only responsible for the terror of that day, but also cast a shadow of darkness that would linger for decades. But how did someone born into wealth choose to become the destroyer of an entire world? The story of Osama bin Laden and that fateful day is not just a grim reminder of the horrors of extremism, but also a lesson on the destructive power of distorted ideology when fueled by wealth and influence. If anyone ever believed that a notorious terrorist must be born out of poverty, injustice, or extreme oppression, Osama bin Laden is living proof of the contrary. Born on March 10, 1957, in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, a land where even the sands glimmer like gold, Osama entered the world in a family so powerful and wealthy that their opulence could make even the princes of 1001 Nights bow in admiration. His father, Mohammed bin Awad bin Laden, was a construction magnate trusted by the Saudi royal family. His mother, Hamida al-Attas, also came from a prominent family. However, the combination of immense wealth and half-hearted parenting planted the seeds of distorted thinking in young Osama's mind. Osama's childhood lacked for nothing, except, it seems, a sense of reality. While other children in the family were groomed to become businessmen, politicians, or at the very least, contributors to society, Osama chose a different path, one of delusional dreams blended with extremist sermons and a peculiar sense of self-importance. The shadow of his powerful father left behind not only a vast fortune, but also an uncontrollable arrogance that Osama inherited. When his father died in a plane crash in 1967, 10-year-old Osama became one of the heirs to the bin Laden empire, a fortune so immense that, if used wisely, it could have positively transformed an entire nation. Instead, Osama chose to use it to pursue ideas so absurd that even he would struggle to explain them. Let's talk about Osama's education, where everything started to veer into the bizarre. He was sent to prestigious schools in Jeddah, but instead of absorbing values of science, reason, or ethics, Osama became engrossed in the teachings of extremist scholars who blamed the West for every problem in the world. One of the figures who had a profound influence on him was Sayyid Qutb, an Islamist ideologue who believed that modernity was a plague and that salvation could only be found by rigidly adhering to Sharia law. Here, we begin to see the formation of Osama bin Laden, not as a wealthy heir with the opportunity to change the world, but as an individual trapped in a combination of self-importance and blind hatred. Osama quickly absorbed the notion that everything associated with the West deserved destruction. He ignored the fact that the modern conveniences he used daily, from cars to communication devices, originated from the societies he despised. This contradiction, rather than causing him to reflect or reconsider, only fueled his aggression in transforming himself into a defender of the faith. But let's not mistake this for the story of a fool misled by circumstances. Osama bin Laden had every chance to choose a different path. He had wealth, power, and a privileged family. Yet instead of building, he chose to destroy. Instead of dialogue, he chose violence. And instead of living a meaningful life, he chose to become a symbol of annihilation. The irony is that his father's fortune, built through monumental projects, including the renovation of Islamic holy sites, became the resource Osama used to fund extremist activities and terrorist attacks. The tragic end of immense wealth and distorted education lies here, a boy born with everything yet growing up to embody terror. He not only deluded himself into believing he was the protector of Islam, but also dragged thousands into his bloody delusions. Osama bin Laden is a stark reminder that ideological distortion does not stem from poverty or deprivation, but can arise from selfish, arrogant, and uncontrolled minds. If money is a tool for changing the world, then Osama bin Laden proved that it can also become a weapon for destroying humanity, when wielded by someone with a warped ideology and a cold heart. And so, from the luxurious schools in Jeddah, from boundless wealth and limitless opportunities, Osama bin Laden stepped onto the global stage, not as a builder, but as a destroyer. If Osama bin Laden's childhood was a strange mix of endless privilege and a lack of intellectual grounding, then his adult years stand as a vivid testament to how profoundly a person can be transformed by misguided ideology. Despite receiving a proper education, possessing immense wealth, and having unlimited opportunities to contribute to building a better world, Osama instead chose to immerse himself in the shadows of extremism and blind hatred. His years at King Abdulaziz University in Jeddah should have been a time for Osama to embrace the values of knowledge and humanity. Instead, he became consumed by the teachings of Muhammad Qutb, the brother of Sayyid Qutb, one of the most extreme Islamist ideologues of the 20th century. Under Qutb's influence, Osama began to internalize a distorted worldview, that modern society was an unrelenting battle between faith and depravity. To Osama, the West was not just an enemy, but the very embodiment of all that was wrong. This dangerous oversimplification not only turned him into a fanatic, but also obscured any capacity for rational judgment. At university, instead of studying economics and business management to take over the family enterprise, Osama spent much of his time poring over Qutb's incendiary writings. He was not merely captivated by Qutb's rhetoric of hatred, he turned it into the intellectual foundation for his entire life. In Osama's mind, he was not a young man searching for a career path, but a warrior of Allah, chosen to save the world from what he deemed Western aggression. Osama's hatred did not remain confined to his thoughts. He began to turn his fanatical ideas into action by attending lectures, organizing small groups, and propagating extremist viewpoints. Encouraged by rigid dogma, Osama started viewing every issue through the lens of a holy war. The irony, however, lies in his complete blindness to the contradictions in his actions. He lived in a world of comfort built on Western technology and science, yet he called for the destruction of every symbol of it. He spoke of loyalty to faith, yet he worshipped violence as the sole solution. Osama bin Laden was not only a fanatic, but also a product of the very contradictions in the society he so vehemently despised. In 1979, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan became a powerful catalyst for Osama bin Laden. Armed with the vast wealth inherited from his father, he quickly transitioned from a propagandist to a so-called hero in the eyes of the Mujahideen fighters. Osama began funding weapons, training fighters, and even personally participating in combat, turning the Soviet intervention into a religious war. But beware of the title hero. Osama was not a leader with vision. He was a dreamer, deluding himself into believing that his every action was the will of God. Under the shadows of the Hindu Kush mountains, Osama not only found a battlefield, but also a platform to build his ambitions. In 1988, within the treacherous caves of the Hindu Kush, Osama bin Laden and his closest fighters laid the foundation for an organization the world would later know as Al-Qaeda, meaning the base or the foundation. However, don't let the simple name fool you. This was no ordinary base, but a machine constructed to spread destruction across the globe. Here, Osama officially transformed his twisted dreams of jihad into a structured framework poised to spread like a storm across the Islamic world and beyond. Initially, Al-Qaeda was designed as a support network for Mujahideen fighters opposing the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. However, when the war ended in 1989 with the Soviet withdrawal, Osama had no intention of dissolving the organization. Instead, he turned it into a paramilitary force with a far grander vision: to wage global jihad, eliminate Western presence in Muslim nations, destroy the State of Israel, and establish an Islamic State governed by strict Sharia law. While earlier terrorist groups focused on specific geographic regions, Osama's Al-Qaeda was a breakthrough. He didn't just aim to control a piece of land, but sought to set the world on fire. Using the enormous wealth from his inheritance, Osama built a sprawling network stretching from the Middle East to Africa and Southeast Asia. He recruited fighters from across the Islamic world, irrespective of nationality or ethnicity. He lured recruits not only with promises of liberation or heavenly rewards, but also through threats and coercion. A key feature of Al-Qaeda was its decentralized nature. allowing local branches to plan and execute independently while adhering to Osama's ideology and vision. Internally, Al-Qaeda operated like a highly organized enterprise. Osama divided the organization into specialized departments, training fighters, managing finances, spreading propaganda, and conducting intelligence operations. He understood that to fight the West, he needed a detailed strategy, not just blind calls to arms. What stood out most in Osama's thinking was not merely his hatred for the West, but how he justified this animosity through distorted religious arguments. He considered the presence of U.S. forces in Saudi Arabia after the First Gulf War the ultimate insult to Islam, particularly as the region is home to Mecca and Medina, Islam's two holiest cities. Osama didn't just oppose the U.S. military, he loathed Western culture as a whole, viewing it as a symbol of moral decay and materialism. The irony lies in his reliance on the very technologies of the West, from weapons to communication systems, to spread his anti-Western ideology and carry out his attacks. One of Osama's most significant strategies was transforming terrorism into a global brand. He understood that beyond killing people, Al-Qaeda needed to instill fear in the hearts of nations and citizens of the West. Each attack wasn't just an act of violence, but a message, a way for Osama to demonstrate his power and capability. He funded and orchestrated several large-scale terrorist attacks, such as the 1998 bombings of U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, which killed over 200 people and injured thousands. Each attack was designed not only to cause physical damage, but also to psychologically destabilize his adversaries. Osama knew that sometimes fear was more powerful than bullets. By the late 1990s, Al-Qaeda was no longer just an organization, but a network. Branches in the Middle East, North Africa, and Southeast Asia began operating vigorously. Training camps in Afghanistan attracted thousands of young men from all over, drawn by a mix of promises of paradise and hatred for the West. However, what made Al-Qaeda unique was its ability to function independently of any single location or leader. While Osama bin Laden was the face of the organization, he created a system flexible enough to continue functioning even if he were eliminated. This made Al-Qaeda a global threat, one that could not be eradicated with a single strike. As Al-Qaeda grew, it became more than a terrorist organization. It transformed into a symbol of ideological warfare, a battle between human values and destruction. Osama bin Laden, with all his wealth, power, and opportunities, chose to make himself an enemy of humanity. He not only attacked Western nations, but also harmed the Muslim community by dragging them into an endless conflict. The rise of Al-Qaeda is a stark reminder of how dangerous extremist ideologies can become when supported and organized systematically. It is a warning that, while darkness may spread, the light of truth and compassion remains something we must always strive to protect. In 1990, the First Gulf War erupted when Iraq, under Saddam Hussein's leadership, invaded Kuwait. Fearing a subsequent invasion, Saudi Arabia allowed U.S. troops to station on its soil. This marked a pivotal moment in Osama bin Laden's ideology. He viewed the presence of infidels, the American military, on sacred land as an unforgivable insult to Islam. Osama did not merely object. He directly proposed to the Saudi government that his Mujahideen forces, which he had organized, could defend the nation's borders against the Iraqi threat. However, this proposal was flatly rejected. Saudi Arabia's continued collaboration with the U.S. left Osama feeling betrayed by his homeland. This was the moment he began openly opposing the Saudi government, severing all ties with the royal family, and starting to build a global anti-American network. In 1991, Osama was expelled from Saudi Arabia and forced to seek refuge elsewhere. Sudan, under the leadership of Omar al-Bashir and a government sympathetic to Islamic extremism, became his sanctuary. In Sudan, Osama was not merely a refugee, but a significant financier of infrastructure projects in exchange for government protection. However, behind these ostensibly constructive activities, Osama quietly transformed Sudan into a training and organizational hub for Al-Qaeda. He established training camps for jihadist fighters, created financial networks to fund terrorist operations, and recruited extremists from across the Islamic world. During this time, Al-Qaeda expanded its reach from the Middle East to Africa and Southeast Asia. While Osama solidified his base in Sudan, Al-Qaeda began conducting its first attacks against Western targets. In 1992, a hotel bombing in Yemen, where American soldiers had once been stationed, marked Al-Qaeda's first public strike. However, this was just the beginning. Osama's ultimate goal was not small-scale attacks, but grand, symbolic acts capable of shaking the world. In 1993, a truck bomb exploded in the basement of the World Trade Center in New York, killing 6 people and injuring over 1,000. This marked the first attempt by Osama and Al-Qaeda to strike at a symbol of America. Although the attack failed to bring down the towers, it demonstrated Al-Qaeda's willingness to carry out attacks deep within the U.S. In 1996, under U.S. pressure and international sanctions, the Sudanese government was forced to expel Osama. He sought refuge in Afghanistan, where the Taliban had recently seized control of most of the country. There, he quickly became a guest of honor to Mullah Muhammad Omar, the Taliban's leader. Under Taliban protection, Osama not only reorganized Al-Qaeda, but also turned Afghanistan into the epicenter of global terrorism. Training camps were expanded to prepare thousands of fighters for future attacks. At this point, Osama was no longer just the leader of a terrorist organization, but had become a symbol of destruction, a man waging war not just against the US, but against the entire Western value system. In 1998, Al-Qaeda executed one of the largest terrorist attacks at the time, the simultaneous bombings of US embassies in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. These devastating blasts killed over 200 people and injured thousands more, most of whom were civilians. This was Osama's direct message to the US, a formal declaration of war. The bombings not only provoked global outrage, but also brought Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden to the forefront of Western intelligence agencies' attention. However, this newfound attention did not intimidate Osama. On the contrary, he saw it as proof of his success. Al-Qaeda continued preparing for even larger attacks, aiming not only for physical damage, but also to instill fear and shake the psyche of the entire world. In the late 1990s, Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda leaders began devising the most brutal terrorist attack in history, the events of September 11, 2001. Their goal was not just to take lives, but to target America's symbols of power and economy. This attack would not merely be an act of violence, but a global declaration that Osama bin Laden's shadow had enveloped the world. On the morning of September 11, 2001, the world witnessed a sequence of unimaginable events. Osama bin Laden and his Al-Qaeda organization turned their deranged ideas into reality through a heinous act of terrorism that not only claimed thousands of innocent lives, but also shook the very foundations of the modern world. This was not just an attack, but a direct challenge to the core of humanity's values. The September 11 attacks were not a product of spontaneity, but the culmination of years of meticulous planning. Under Osama bin Laden's leadership, Al-Qaeda assembled a group of 19 terrorists, each carefully selected for their skills and blind loyalty. These individuals were trained in Al-Qaeda's camps in Afghanistan, where they learned to pilot commercial aircraft and prepared for suicide missions. Osama was not only the mastermind, but also the supreme commander, overseeing every detail of the operation. He selected the targets not merely for their physical impact, but for their symbolic significance. The World Trade Center in New York as an economic symbol, the Pentagon as a military symbol, and possibly the US Capitol as a political symbol. That morning, 4 commercial airliners were hijacked almost simultaneously after takeoff. The first 2 planes, American Airlines Flight 11 and United Airlines Flight 175, crashed into the north and south towers of the World Trade Center at 8:46 a.m. and 9:03 a.m., respectively. These collisions not only destroyed the upper portions of the towers, but also ignited a nightmare no one could have foreseen. Just over an hour later, at 9:37 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77 slammed into the Pentagon, the nerve center of the U.S. military, killing 125 people on the ground, along with all passengers and crew. The 4th plane, United Airlines Flight 93, was thwarted by passenger resistance and crashed into a field in Pennsylvania before it could reach its intended target, believed to be the U.S. Capitol or the White House. The image of New York's iconic Twin Towers collapsing at 9:59 a.m. and 10:28 a.m. became etched into the world's collective memory. Nearly 3,000 people lost their lives, thousands were injured, and all of Manhattan was shrouded in smoke, dust, and panic. Osama bin Laden wasted no time in proclaiming the success of Al-Qaeda. He hailed September 11 as a great victory over the West and a devastating blow to America's pride. However, this was not an act of faith, but a stark demonstration of the cruelty and distorted ideology of a fanatic. Osama did not only target America, he also aimed to polarize the global Muslim community, forcing them to choose between support or condemnation. He claimed that by attacking the US, which he saw as Islam's greatest enemy, he was defending religion and humanity. In reality, his actions achieved nothing but increased fear, violence, and the stigmatization of innocent Muslims worldwide. The aftermath of September 11 extended far beyond the death toll and material destruction. It fundamentally altered the way the world operated. Under President George W. Bush's leadership, the U.S. launched the global war on terror. On October 7, 2001, the U.S. initiated a military campaign in Afghanistan aimed at toppling the Taliban regime, which had sheltered Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. The pain of September 11 also created another nightmare. Millions of Muslims worldwide became targets of prejudice and violence. The hatred sown by Osama did not only harm the West, but also fractured the very community he claimed to defend. After September 11, 2001, Osama bin Laden, who once arrogantly proclaimed himself a great warrior defending Islam, began a life of hiding like a coward. Gone were the grandiose public speeches, and the image of a leader revered by Mujahideen fighters faded. Instead, he became a fugitive running from his own shadow, slinking through caves and secret compounds, perpetually living in fear of being discovered. Despite being relentlessly pursued, Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda continued their activities. From caves and secret hideouts in Afghanistan and Pakistan, Osama orchestrated operations while his loyal followers carried out terrorist attacks across the globe, from the 2002 Bali bombings to attacks in Madrid and London in subsequent years. What Osama did not anticipate was the world's resolute resistance against Al-Qaeda's destruction. While the pain of September 11 remained indelible, nations united to combat the menace of Al-Qaeda. Military campaigns in Afghanistan and Pakistan, combined with international intelligence efforts, ultimately forced Osama into a corner. When the US launched its war in Afghanistan in October 2001, Osama realized his safe haven under the Taliban's protection was over. Continuous airstrikes by the US and its allies not only weakened the Taliban, but also targeted Al-Qaeda training camps and hideouts. The man who once boldly declared war on the West now scrambled to flee his strongholds in the Hindu Kush Mountains. By late 2001, Osama and a small group of loyalists were hiding in the caves of Tora Bora, a rugged mountainous area near the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. There, he narrowly escaped capture during a US Special Forces and Afghan military assault. Thanks to support from loyal fighters and disorganized military operations, Osama slipped across the Pakistani border in early 2002. In the following years, Osama lived in exile in Pakistan, not as a warrior, but as someone reliant on the loyalty of local extremists. He frequently moved between the treacherous mountainous regions of Waziristan, a tribal area near the Afghan border. Osama's life during this period was a continuous cycle of changing hideouts to evade US and allied forces. Ironically, Osama began to cut himself off from the very organization he had founded. To avoid detection, he refused to use any modern communication devices. All directives to Al-Qaeda were sent through couriers, causing him to lose control over the sprawling terrorist network he had built. Meanwhile, regional Al-Qaeda branches began operating independently, no longer reliant on their supreme leader. In 2005, Osama moved to a fortified compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan. This would become his final hideout for the next 6 years, completely isolated from the outside world. The compound was designed like a fortress, with nearly 6-meter-high concrete walls, barbed wire, and minimal windows. Inside, he lived with 3 wives, several children, and a small group of attendants. Osama's life in Abbottabad resembled that of a prisoner in his own home. He dared not leave the compound, avoided contact with neighbors, and remained entirely cut off from the outside world. His attendants even burned documents in the courtyard to avoid leaving any trace. The image of the holy warrior had vanished, replaced by that of a fugitive trapped in his paranoia. Throughout Osama's years in hiding, the US government never stopped hunting him. Using even the smallest leads, the CIA gradually tracked his whereabouts. In 2009, US operatives identified Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti, a trusted courier of Osama. After years of surveillance, they traced al-Kuwaiti to a compound in Abbottabad, which was flagged as highly suspicious due to its unusual security measures. On May 1, 2011, after President Barack Obama approved the mission, 2 Black Hawk helicopters carrying US Navy SEALs flew to Abbottabad. After an hour-long operation, Osama bin Laden, who had once proclaimed himself the leader of the Islamic world, was shot dead in his bedroom, a gun lying unused by his side. Osama died a coward, unable to face the consequences of his actions. His body was swiftly transported to a US ship and buried at sea in accordance with Islamic burial practices, ensuring that no land site would become a shrine for extremists who idolized him. Osama's death marked the end of a dark chapter in history and exposed his true nature. Not a brave warrior, but a coward fleeing the aftermath of his own atrocities. The death of Osama bin Laden in 2011 not only marked the end of one of history's most dangerous terrorists, but also triggered a series of investigations to shed light on the mysteries surrounding his life, ideology, and organization. From the moment after the September 11 attacks, US intelligence agencies such as the CIA and FBI relentlessly pursued evidence to unravel the secrets of Al-Qaeda and its leader. Yet, it was only after Osama's death, when documents seized from his Abbottabad compound were declassified, that the world began to truly understand what he had done, what he dreamed of, and the chaotic state of his mind. When US Special Forces killed Osama, they seized a treasure trove of materials from his compound: laptops, hard drives, and hundreds of handwritten documents. These data painted a starkly different picture of Osama bin Laden from the powerful jihadist warrior image he had cultivated. In reality, during his final years, Osama had become isolated, even within his own organization. Numerous Al-Qaeda branches from North Africa to Southeast Asia had started operating independently, no longer adhering to directives from the central hub in Afghanistan or Pakistan. This left Osama in a state of panic, desperately trying to maintain control through handwritten letters, though his efforts were often hindered by a lack of communication. The documents also revealed that Osama spent his final years obsessing over continued attacks against the United States. He pushed for grander terrorist plots, even fantasizing about overthrowing moderate Islamic governments that he deemed traitorous. However, these efforts amounted to little more than paper tigers, as he no longer had the practical power to execute such delusional plans. The investigations also raised questions about the role of the Pakistani government in concealing Osama's presence. His fortified compound in Abbottabad was located near a major military academy, sparking suspicions that certain elements within Pakistan's government or military were aware of his whereabouts, but chose to ignore them. Declassified reports from the CIA and the White House later indicated that the US harbored suspicions about this cooperation, but lacked concrete evidence to prove it. This relationship remains one of the most significant unresolved mysteries surrounding Osama's life. Osama bin Laden lived a life history we'll never forget, not for greatness, but for the atrocities he committed against humanity. Born into wealth, endowed with every opportunity to do good, he instead chose a path of violence and hatred. His life was a series of misguided decisions that resulted in the deaths of thousands of innocent people and inflicted deep wounds on global relations between nations and religions. In the end, Osama paid the price for his actions. He died not as a hero or a leader, but as a coward, shot in the darkness of isolation, condemned by history. The legacy he left behind was not the revival of a united Islamic world as he had dreamed, but one of disintegration, division, and grief. Osama bin Laden's death cannot erase the pain he caused, but it stands as proof that violence and extremism never prevail. The world united against the distorted ideologies he propagated, and his story will forever serve as a reminder to humanity. No one can escape the consequences of hatred, no matter how deeply they hide in the shadows.